The tropes of the horror genre are more important to it than maybe any other genre. Many of the tropes are obvious and well documented, such as naked, licentious teens getting hacked to death by a faceless man with a knife, or the characters being stupid and saying that they need to split up. But a thematic trope that is caked into most horror movies is that of the nihilistic ending. But the nihilistic ending didn't become a major part of the genre until the 60s and 70s. But this is indicative of a major shift in American culture throughout the latter half of the 20th century that influenced all of American film, not just the horror genre. But to understand the shift, we have to go back. Throughout a large portion of human history, warfare was viewed as something honorable, a duty and a privilege to die for your kingdom or your clan. Dying in battle was an honorable thing in multiple cultures. In Norse mythology, only those who are slain in battle enter Valhalla. Samurai would perform seppuku, a ritualistic suicide that would allow the samurai to maintain their honor. By today's standards, this may seem absurd, but it made sense to view war in this way because war was different than it is now. Two soldiers with swords dueling it out to see who the victor was, as brutal as it is, does have a more honorable connotation to it. Then guns were invented, and warfare became less honorable. It makes sense how overpowering your opponent with superior strength and technique would be viewed highly, but it was hard to justify getting shot and dying in half a second as an honorable moment. The art of warfare changed in the 12 to 1700s because of guns. Jump to the Revolutionary War and we have soldiers lining up to get shot. This seems like a terrible tactic, and it is, but battle was still seen as something that should have valor and honor. Dying in battle this way made the crude, brutal efficiency of a firearm seem like you were still dying for something. Tactics such as ambushing, hiding, and altering the battlefield was seen as extremely dishonorable and immoral. Essentially, it was like cheating, as odd as that sounds in warfare, but that is how battle was viewed then. During the Napoleonic Wars in the early 1800s, Napoleon utilized the cannon heavily in battle. The cannon was an advancement in technology that was even more deadly than the gun. This was the start of the shift, but the Napoleonic Wars were probably the last quote-unquote honorable wars. 46 years after the Napoleonic Wars, the American Civil War started. The American Civil War was among the earliest to use industrial warfare. Railroads, the telegraph, steamships, the ironclad warships, and mass-produced weapons saw wide use. In total, the war left between 620,000 and 750,000 soldiers dead, along with an undetermined number of civilian casualties. The Civil War remains the deadliest military conflict in American history. Not only was the content and reasoning behind the Civil War disturbing, the entire conflict was brutal and bloody. With it being one of the earliest industrial wars, the relationship between technological advancement and warfare brutality became more apparent. The technology and brutality of the Civil War foreshadowed the coming of world wars. The two world wars changed everything, and this is what sparks the change in the endings of horror movies. The two world wars are obviously some of the most brutal, bloodthirsty, and barbaric events in human history. Muskets and cannons were crude in comparison to the warfare before, but the technological advancement in weaponry that occurred for the First and Second World War were unmatched. We went from muskets to machine guns, cannons to mortars, cavalry to tanks. We had aerial warfare and submarine warfare. Specifically with World War I, trench warfare was the most common practice. Trench warfare is an inhumane, brutal tactic where the soldiers will hide in trenches on either side with a large area called no man's land in the center. Soldiers would fire over the trenches, but both sides were incredibly protected by the trench, leading to extremely abhorrent stalemates and long, grueling battles of attrition. Captains or commanders would call for the men to go over the top, meaning to rush out of the trench, charge into no man's land, and try to make it to the enemy's trenches. The enemies would often have Maxim guns, which would mow down the charging soldiers with ease, making going over the top a suicide mission. This is not the same type of honorable warfare. This is not two knights dueling for chivalry and the honor of their king and god. This isn't a battle of superior might or skill. This is your superior officer telling you to run and die. This wasn't fighting until your last breath like a Spartan. This was you being squashed like an ant under a boot. Even if the soldiers didn't go over the top, the conditions within the trenches were abhorrent. There were so many flies and bugs, especially because they didn't have easy access to bathrooms. Sometimes if a soldier would die in the trench, it may be hard to get them out, so they'd stay there for a little bit, rotting. If you didn't die going over the top, you might have died from disease in the trenches as well. Artillery was utilized heavily in the First World War, especially in the brutal Battle of Verdun on the Western Front. There was so much artillery used that giant craters formed on the battlefield that can still be seen today. These craters were used by the soldiers to go to the bathroom, as it was better than using the ground they stood on. The mixture of rainwater, dirt, mud, urine, feces, and the noxious gas used in some chemical artillery created a terrifying and deadly concoction in these craters. At night, soldiers would need to relieve themselves and go to these craters. Both the black of night, soldiers would slip and fall to their deaths into the noxious pits, adding their decomposing bodies to the crater's contents. This is not the warfare of glory and honor. This is tragic, brutal, and disturbing. The Second World War just exacerbated the first, technological advancements improving the efficiency of murder machines. The two world wars, especially being so close to each other, forever changed all of the world, artistically, technologically, ideologically, and culturally. Art from before the wars versus art after the wars displays this perfectly, and film is the same way. Now onto how this coincides with how horror movies end. Horror movies before the war, such as the Universal classic monster movies, generally end wrapped up nicely. At the end of Dracula, Van Helsing impales him. At the end of Frankenstein, Frankenstein's monster is trapped in a burning building. The end of these classic horror films is similar to the endings of classical storytelling. The antagonists are defeated and the protagonists prevail. This is in no way insinuating that these classic horror movies are less good or not as intellectually deep, but more that the trends of early horror films follow this pattern. After World War II, however, horror movies began to shift in how their endings were implemented. One of the greatest examples of this phenomena is the ending of 1958's The Blob. The film ends with the titular monster being transported to the Arctic, where it will freeze but not die. This was a solution, but the evil was not completely eradicated. It still looms off in the distance. This is punctuated by the film's ending with a "the end?" with a question mark, insinuating that this might not be the end. This is the predecessor to the more common endings in the latter half of the 20th century, the idea that evil is always there and it won't go away. After the World Wars altered the way many people look at the world, postmodernism became prevalent. Postmodernism is an extremely broad and vague umbrella term that basically encapsulates the changing mindset of the general public after the World Wars, and especially during and after the Vietnam War. Postmodernism is characterized by questioning of authority, religious or governmental, questioning of traditions and customs, and constantly changing perspectives on how the world should be. With postmodernism came a more cynical and existential mentality about the world and the governments that control it. As the horror genre progressed through the 1900s, the endings reflected the cynical and existential ideology. One of the most influential horror movies of all time, 1960's Psycho, does end with the antagonist getting arrested, but the iconic chilling stare that ends the film lingers the dread within you, because Norman Bates isn't an extraterrestrial or a supernatural monster. He is a human, and the events of Psycho display that any human is capable of what Bates did. In 1968, George Romero released Night of the Living Dead, which further solidified this bleak, unnerving ending trend. The main character, Ben, is the only one that survived the brutal and terrifying events of the film. Towards the end of the movie, we see that the living dead are being wiped out by the authorities, and that Ben will be able to get out at the end. But in a wild twist of events, the saviors mistake Ben for a zombie and shoot him, demolishing the built-up, relieving ending to the tense film. This macabre and dark punctuation of the film displays this new cynical mindset that is prevailing in American youth. In 1974, Tobe Hooper gave us arguably the greatest horror movie ever made, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, which is one of the best examples of this ending phenomena. The antagonists of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre are a family of cannibals that the group of teens accidentally bumps into. The second half of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre is a depraved, uncomfortable, mind-grinding experience of terror full of shrieks and screams. Sally Hardesty is put through some incredibly disturbing and traumatic experiences inside the hellhole of the Sawyer's house. Sally eventually escapes after being tormented and chased by Leatherface for a while. The film ends with Sally covered in blood, screaming as she hitches a ride on the back of a pickup truck, while Leatherface swings around his chainsaw. Sally escaped the antagonists, but did not defeat them. Sally's emotion at the end of the film isn't relief escaping her tormentors, it's erratic fear and an inexplicable explosion of traumatic emotions. This is the face of somebody who's going to have PTSD for the rest of their lives. Relating back to how war influenced this, PTSD was becoming an apparent aspect of soldiers' lives, especially since the Texas Chainsaw Massacre came out on the tail end of the Vietnam War, a war that is notorious for inflicting PTSD. Not only is the ending of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre showing the lasting effects of the antagonist on the protagonist, it also shows that the antagonists are still around and still at large. The film doesn't have a satisfying conclusion that tells the audience that the evil will be vanquished. The Sawyers are out there still, waiting for their next victims. Dracula was defeated, Leatherface was endured. Halloween in 1978 ends with Michael Myers seemingly being shot to death and falling off the balcony. However, when peering over the balcony, Michael has vanished and his theme music plays. Halloween ends with empty shots of the place that Michael has been with his iconic mask breathing, insinuating he is still there, stalking at every possible spot, even if you can't see him. This longing, eerie feeling of fear that persists even after the movie is emblematic of the shift in the horror genre. After watching Dracula, you are no longer scared that Dracula will get you because Dracula was defeated. But after the Texas Chainsaw Massacre or Halloween, you know that Michael or Leatherface may still be out there waiting for you, watching you. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre had a massive influence on how horror movies ended, specifically with the screams from Sally. Many horror movies going forward have a cynical and nihilistic dread to end them, making it so that they aren't wrapped up, but just that the character survived something horrific, and now they have to learn to deal with it, i.e. what a soldier from the World Wars or Vietnam has to deal with. Hostel from 2005 is a great example of this. The main character survives a trafficking scheme in which the rich spend loads of money to torture the captive individuals. He saw the true brutality and horrors of humanity, and the film ends with him on a train, just staring. The nihilistic expression of what he just went through compared to Sally Hardesty at the end of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre represent different reactions to similar circumstances. Both characters went through a dreadful and horrifying ride of pure terror. They witnessed the grotesque and macabre of the human psyche, and now they have to live with the psychological aftermath. Another great example of this is 2007's The Mist. This ending is so jaw-dropping and gut-punching, I won't even tell you what happens, just go watch the movie. But if you know, you know. There are some categories we can create through how these films end. Category 1 is nihilistic shock, which is what the Texas Chainsaw Massacre and Hostel have. Category 2 is the gut-punching unresolution, which is what Night of the Living Dead and The Mist have. The third category is unending terror, which is what Halloween and Friday the 13th have, where the villain never goes away, signaling that the horror can never be defeated. Don't forget to like and subscribe to this video and check out my Patreon and my other platforms all in the description below. I have just launched my Patreon. I'd really appreciate it if you went and checked it out, and it will be expanding as the channel grows. Thank you all.